Hello, welcome to PNAA Rise Up, Real Issues and Stories of Every One of Us podcast. For this episode, our guest is Magen Kellam. But first, let me introduce ourselves. I'm Manny Ramos, a board member of PNAA and a past president of the Philippine Nurses Association of Central Florida. I'm a professor of nursing at Valencia College and an adjunct professor at William Patterson University. With me today is my co-host, Mindy Ofiana. Mindy?
Hello, Manny. Welcome, everyone.
Hi, Mindy.
I'm Mindy Ofiana, Legislative Committee Chair of PNAA and the corresponding secretary for PNAA Foundation. I was the past president for PNAA Southern California. Before my retirement, I served as both the Chief Operating Officer and Chief Nursing Officer at one of the medical centers owned by KPC Group of Companies. Manny?
Thank you, Mindy. Now let me introduce our guest. Our guest is Magen Kellam, an immigration attorney and founder of the law offices of Magen E. Kellam in Naples, Florida. Magen represents clients before the U.S. Immigration Services, the U.S. Immigration Court, the U.S. Department of Labor, U.S. Department of State, and the U.S. Consulates and Embassies around the world. For more than 17 years, she has advocated for individuals across the globe in matters from U.S. citizenship to deportation defense. She's an advocate for human rights and has collaborated with government and non-government organizations to pursue justice for immigrant and foreign workers. Magen is best known for her work in the fight against human trafficking, and since 2006, she has represented and assisted countless survivors of sex and labor trafficking. Her mission includes seeking justice in court, immigration relief, educating the community, preventing exploitation, and empowering survivors. Magen, welcome to Rise Up.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, Magen, I'm going to ask the first question, and that would be, what attracted you to specialize in immigration law?
To be honest, I think I was always on this path, and I just didn't realize it. While I was in law school, I didn't have a lot of exposure to immigration law, just the basics. But I will tell you that when I was in high school, a very dear friend of mine her family was not from the United States, and she was my best friend in the entire world. And I saw her go through so many struggles with her family trying to get their permanent residency and then ultimately their citizenship. And I think it piqued my interest all the way back in high school. So I think that set me on a trajectory, and I found myself doing it now.
Mm-hmm. You know, Magen, immigration is one of the fundamental building blocks that shaped America become a unique nation that it is today. What would you consider to be America's most significant issues in immigration?
There are so many. That's a very difficult question to ask. I think that the system, unfortunately, is under immense pressure. And right now, with the COVID shutdowns and everything that's happened, since January, February, March 2020, the immigration system it's under more stress than ever. We have significant backlogs. We have separations of families. And because of these backlogs and the massive amount of time it's taking to process basic applications, we're seeing employers suffer, we're seeing workers suffer, and families suffer. So, I don't think I could narrow it down to what the primary issue is, but one of the worst right now is the backlogs and the sheer amount of time it's taking to process anything in the immigration.
I see.
Okay. So, I saw in your background about human trafficking. So for our listeners and viewers who may not be familiar with human trafficking, would you define what human trafficking is?
Yeah, sure. So human trafficking is really about the exploitation of people. I think a lot of individuals get it confused with maybe smuggling or, the transportation of people from place to place. But But human trafficking is really about exploitation. And I think sex trafficking gets the most press and media coverage, but an area that I've been really working on trying to shed more light on is labor trafficking, because it is a big problem. It's a problem across industries. And because there's not a lot of discussion about it, I think it's easy to, cases slip through the cracks a lot easier.
Mm-hmm.
So for the person who's a victim of labor trafficking, what resources are available for them?
Well, it depends. It depends in what stage that we can identify the individual. And it really boils down to, case by case basis.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the individuals I work with are non-Americans, they're non-citizens. And so there is that immigration component to it.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, if someone is recruited from their home country based on the promise of a wonderful job in the United States and the idea of the American dream, and they're brought here under false pretenses, now they're here and, potentially there was some visa issues or immigration issues, getting out from underneath employment issues can be a problem. So there's so many levels and so many issues that have to be dealt with. Our law enforcement agencies can be resources. There are non-government organizations that can be resources. We're trying to spread the word. There are lawyers and other, professionals that are trying to help, but it's really tough. It's honestly a very, very difficult problem to face.
Mm-hmm.
So, Magen, in your work related to labor trafficking, do you see a lot of nurses who have come to reach out to you related to their issues?
I do. And I think that's what brought us all together here today is, I have been lucky enough to find myself involved in a really wonderful Filipino community. And it goes all the way back to 2006 when I was first involved in, it was actually a healthcare staffing company case where some Filipino workers were brought to the United States to do some healthcare work. And that was not the result of what happened when they got here. And so through that, I have just somehow found myself involved in the Filipino community, and they're so tight knit, and they've passed my name around. And so since 2006, a bulk of my work has been working with Filipino healthcare workers, nurses, physical therapists.
So in that note, there are rights of foreign educated healthcare workers, right? And also there are rights for the employers. Where is the division? Where is the legal aspect that would be different or would cause a litigation on either side, whether you're an employer or the victim?
Sure. And I want to preface my responses with this. Some things I may say today, my intention is not to scare anyone that might be listening to this. Really, my intention is to help empower people. And I realize that when somebody is focused on a goal, for example, if you're a nurse in the Philippines and you want to come to the United States or any other country to work, you can be so focused on that goal that sometimes things fall through the cracks, almost like a surfer waiting to catch a big wave. You focus so hard on that wave, you might not realize that there are sharks swimming around you. And, I think that some of the problems start at the very beginning when people are so focused on their goal and the excitement. I think that they might take situations for granted or maybe so enticed by the excitement that they aren't really doing everything they can do to protect themselves.
I see.
And so when you say what are some of the issues that can come about, I mean, a lot of it is contract issues. And that's where the legal framework can come into play. But it's really much more than that. It's really human issues. But the contract issues seem to be what brings the conflict to the surface. But I know that from personal experience and a lot of the nurses that I've spoken with through the years, they get so excited and focused on studying for the exams and doing all of the preparation in order to get to the United States. And they maybe didn't focus on reading their contract enough, or they maybe didn't understand exactly what they were promising. And once they got to the United States, then they realized, hey, this is not what I signed up for, or I didn't realize I would have these obligations. And so, that's really when the breakdown starts to happen.
So from a practical standpoint, Magen, for those who are listening today, they may know someone who is needing this type of help or in this type of help or in this situation already, or they themselves could be listening to this podcast. How do they start that process? Because some of them are afraid of intimidation and retaliation, losing their job, which obviously they need, right, to provide for themselves for food and securing their shelter. A lot of them may be very hesitant to speak up or probably don't even know where to start to reach out for help. What would be your practical advice for them to even just start the process of seeking help if they are in that type of situation, or if somebody knows someone who is in that type of a situation?
Absolutely. The first thing to do is ask for help. If there's ever a situation where you don't understand, it is to ask for help and to reach out to people you trust in your community, or, for example, organizations like yourselves or other organizations that have support and may be able to refer them to somebody. I know that reaching out to a lawyer can be intimidating, and it almost feels like it's going to snowball into a bigger problem. But really the first step is to just ask the question. Mm-hmm. And I encourage people, especially if in their gut they're feeling something is wrong or they're not sure if they're being treated properly, the best way to start is to say, hey, let me call someone that might be able to answer these questions. And maybe I realize, wow, I'm not being treated fairly. Mm-hmm. Or maybe I find out, nope, this is how it works. Because as Mindy said, workers have rights in the United States, and so do employers. Yeah. And so, if you sign a contract, you need to understand what the ramifications are for you and for the employer if you're not abiding by that contract. But, one important thing is to not feel intimidated and to know that there really are people out there that are in this area and willing to help. Because I think so many of the nurses I talked to said the reason they didn't is they just felt scared, or they felt alone, or they didn't want to get in trouble. And that's where my heart breaks, because, people will put themselves in a situation much longer than they need to, just out of fear.
Mm-hmm. I'm listening to the things that sort of like if I put the analogy of a disease, it's like we're doing a cure for that disease. So as a nurse, I'm a believer in prevention. So what advice can you share with us so that we can prevent them once they come here, that they're not going to be facing such harmful, if you will, for lack of a better term, harmful practices of traffickers?
Mindy, that is an excellent question. And so if you remember with what I said, that human trafficking is about exploitation, right? It's about taking advantage of workers in a way that it wasn't intended. Mm-hmm. And that can be a number of things. So it can be promising somebody a salary and not paying them according to either the immigration requirements or according to their contract. It can be promising someone a job, and as soon as they enter the United States, then they tell you, oh, well, we don't have a job for you yet. and requiring that person to wait weeks without pay. There's all different types of exploitation. Mm-hmm. But you're right. Prevention is the key. And it starts all the way back in the Philippines. Yeah. When you're meeting the recruiter or the staffing company for that very first time, if you are presented with a contract, it's important to read it. And I know, trust me, I'm a lawyer and I know what contracts, I tell my clients, read them if you want to fall asleep at night, because they can put you to sleep and they're full of words that don't make sense. But when it's about your future, especially if you're relocating and moving to a whole new country, that's got to be step one, is reading your contracts and trying to understand them. And also your immigration documents. You would be shocked at how often I talk to people that say, well, I never got to look at them, or they just gave me the signature page and I didn't realize what I was signing. And those immigration documents contain such important information and obligation for both the employer and the employee. So without having an understanding of them, it can really open the door to problems. Mm-hmm.
So in relation to those contracts, Magen, just as what you mentioned, sometimes they're so excited, these nurses from foreign countries, they're so excited to come to the US and work. And oftentimes they haven't really fully understood the contract, and some probably just signed it. So would that ever be a ground for, not binding with the contract? If they, would that ever stand if they say, well, I never really understood it?
Not necessarily. There are certain defenses to a contract, if you were forced into it or they were signed under duress. But, really, if you're over 18 and you are of legal capacity in the United States, if you sign a contract, you should read it and try to understand. But, there are some things that I think are red flags that people can look for in these contracts. And at least it can help them ask some questions. But here's the caveat, is I know that it's a competitive area. And I know that there are, a lot of nurses that want to go to other countries to provide their services. And so a lot of times people are afraid, well, if I ask questions, then they won't choose me or I won't get the job. Right. And what I challenge people to think about is maybe that's okay. Maybe that's the path you should be on. If they're not willing to choose you because you have questions, well, what happens if there's a problem once you get in the United States? You want to start off on a good foot. You want to start off with a strong understanding of what your obligations are. Yeah. And if a company is not willing to at least provide you time to understand the contract, that might be something you might want to give a little more thought to. But, some other red flags and some things that I see that are very typical, and I will say these are red flags. These are not always the sign of a problem, but some things that would raise my eyebrow as an attorney would be if a recruiting company or a staffing agency is vague about who the employer is going to be. If they are vague about where the job is going to be, because I have personal experiences where people were promised jobs here in Florida and they get to Florida and they've never worked in Florida. They're sent to other states. They're separated from family that they thought they'd be able to live with in Florida. And, so you want to make sure that you have a real understanding of what the job is, where the job is, and who your employer is. And those things should be spelled out in a contract. Mm-hmm.
I see. As you are speaking, my memories of me coming to the United States, because I came here as a working visa. And one, I did not read my contract. There was so much trust in that recruitment agency that maybe I'm lucky that I was not part of being the victim of trafficking. However, I have a friend who is a chief nursing officer, and currently they're experiencing where they recruit, and as soon as the nurses comes, sits in the airport. They don't even go to the hospital that recruited them. Is that right? I mean, do they have that right of just not abandoning that hospital that recruited them? Does the employer have the right to sue?
That's a complicated question, and it boils down to what the contract documents are and what the immigration documents are, and also what kind of visa you're brought over. So it's very different. It can be different if you're an H-1B worker versus labor certification, the green card workers.
They're green card holders. They're green card holders, and that's the reason why they have the. How do you get that? They take the risk of not joining the organization that recruited them and just go somewhere else, so.
Yeah. And it can be a problem. That's one issue that comes up a lot in situations that I've dealt with, where an individual is recruited by one company and signs a contract with one company. Their immigration documents, the sponsor is an entirely different company. Then they get to the United States and they're sent to work for somebody else that they've never even heard of. Now, it could be a complex web of contracts between those companies. But, in my opinion, that can be a red flag in and of itself. Why does it need to be so complicated? And Mindy, you asked about, issues with immigration, and this is one of them where we have been pushing for reform in this area, where, a lot of the bill proposals for immigration reform, if there's not accountability for the employers, then it opens up to more exploitation of workers. Mm-hmm. And so, with these recruiting companies, if the workers are brought to the United States and then they're sent to work for someone else that didn't sponsor them, that can be a big issue. And it could in fact put their green card in jeopardy, or it could cause problems with naturalization because their immigrant visa was based on that job sponsor.
Yeah. That's true.
So it's all very intertwined in a very complicated framework. And I get being excited about the contracts. I get that. And I understand. But when you are putting that much trust, what I hope to let people know is that there are good recruitment companies. There are good staffing agencies, but there are also predatory recruiters and predatory staffing agencies that really are looking for cheap foreign labor. Mm-hmm. And it's really tough once you're in the United States and you feel trapped in a situation where if you don't go work for who they told you to work for, they threaten to sue you for thousands and thousands of dollars. Yeah. Or they threaten, breach of contract. They threaten calling immigration, deportation, all of these things. And that can be very inappropriate. I mean, there should not be threats to deportation if you're not, working if you're not. Let me rewind. Threats of deportation can be a real bad sign if it's used to force people to continue to work in an inappropriate situation.
I see.
So, Magen, does the state have an obligation to a victim of labor trafficking?
An obligation? I don't know how to answer that. I don't know.
So,
I think they should have an obligation. But I think part of the problem is that, as I said before, there's so little information on labor trafficking. We're just now starting to see some victimized workers stand up and speak out, and we're seeing some lawsuits being filed against, predatory recruitment companies and predatory staffing agencies, and that's motivating change. which is excellent. And we are seeing eyes now on this area where people are realizing human trafficking is not just sex trafficking. It can, it could be the woman cleaning a hotel room. It could be the nurse providing you frontline healthcare services in a pandemic. I mean, you can see this everywhere. So in terms of, is there an obligation? I can say that there are resources that can be provided if somebody is identified as a human trafficking victim or survivor. But getting there is the hard part, because many times it takes years before that can even occur.
So let me do a quick follow-up on that question, because so for example, for those clients that you've had wherein they didn't have any choice but to leave their employer because of the working conditions that they couldn't, that are unfair or unlawful or illegal, and now essentially they are left with no source of income to secure their food and shelter. Have they shared, therefore, how was that managed, or what resources have they tapped? Have they shared any?
So what I can tell you that might be helpful is a basic situation from start to finish. So and unfortunately, it's almost cookie cutter. I see the same blueprint over and over again. So it will be a Filipino trained nurse who is in the Philippines and who is recruited to work in the United States, signs that contract and is so excited and maybe doesn't pay attention, maybe doesn't read it, maybe doesn't understand it, or is afraid they won't get the job. Brought to the United States, sent to an employer that was not who was promised, paid less than what was promised, working in areas that were not promised. For example, one of my clients, she was brought over to be a physical therapist, and they forced her to work in physical therapist assistant position, which is got a much lower pay rate, and definitely put her in a financial strain. Or there have been times where my clients are nurses and they are promised a nursing position, but they're forced to work as nurses assistants. And eventually, Manny, as you suggest, they get to a point where they can't continue. They're not earning enough to pay for their family. They're not earning enough to survive on, or they're being overworked or exploited in other ways. Those that do decide to leave, in many cases that I've worked on, they have faced threats of deportation, threats of lawsuits. Many have had lawsuits filed against them. And unfortunately, they have had to bear the brunt of a lot of that burden. And I think some of it is fear. But there are also those who are now getting the courage to stand up and fight back. And that is something that our law allows for. If in terms of a contract, if you sign a contract with someone and they're not performing, they're not doing what they promised, and you are, that can be a defense. That can be a defense to a breach of contract if someone else broke the contract first. Now, this is complicated and, don't take legal advice from a podcast sort of thing. But, it's complicated. But, those are areas where people need to understand that they can be empowered and they should reach out and they should ask the questions. Otherwise, they are forced to bear the brunt of it. And there are not, that I'm aware of, there are not a lot of organizations that will provide unlimited resources for people in these situations.
So, Magen, in your line of work, there are ups and downs of the line of work that you do. How do you feel? Do you have more successes than failures?
I don't consider, I really don't see myself as having a lot of failures, because I look at in terms of, especially with the trafficking and the labor trafficking, if someone even calls me and reaches out, that's a success.
Yeah.
If someone says, hey, can you just read my contract and can you tell me, is it right that my employer is doing A, B, C, and D? That's a success. And once you start that dialogue, then you can prepare a plan, or you can assess your situation and decide how best to help the person that's that's feeling exploited or feeling like they're being taken advantage of.
So before we end this podcast, Megan, we had a few questions that came in since they knew we were going to be talking about this topic in this episode of podcast. And one of them is it legal for the contracting agency to hold their green cards while they are under contract?
That is inappropriate. That is inappropriate. They should immediately turn over those documents to the recipient. Passports, green cards, identifying documents, they should be in possession of the person that they were issued to. They should not be retained by the employer or agency.
Okay. And one last question. What does it mean for a legal migrant worker who came here, like, for example, a nurse who came in here? What does the phrase that says equal pay, equal work, what may that imply for a nurse? And what are the rights, associated with that?
I'm not sure I'm familiar with that phrase in any particular situation. But what I will say is that in the term, as it relates to, maybe a foreign worker from abroad that's coming to the United States, they are entitled to fair pay, fair compensation. Mm-hmm. But do you have any other information about what that in a setting or how it was being used?
They were asking about the rate of pay compared mm-hmm. to the nurses who are, let's say, for example, American nurses, okay, compared to foreign educated health professionals,
okay,
who come in as nurses. Do they have a certain right as related to wages?
Well, that depends. Now, I will preface this by saying that I believe that inequality in the workplace, especially in healthcare, that negatively impacts the quality of care. Anybody that's working in the United States, they should be, offered a competitive and fair wage. Now, if it is an individual that has come over on a specific type of visa or a labor certification, there are some obligations in those immigration documents in terms of being paid the prevailing wage. But I think sometimes the nurses will find that they were brought here and they're being paid a wage, and they realize, oh, wow, someone who wasn't brought over by a recruitment company or staffing company are making substantially more. And it is part of the problem with this type of, like I said, this blueprint of the situation. So, that is what some of the proposals for change are, is to make sure that their recruitment, I will put it this way, recruitment and staffing agencies should be required to compete in a free and fair labor market, just like any other organization. And that means offer competitive wages and not be able to trap people in contracts with lower paying wages for significant period of time. So, and I must also say that I am not a labor lawyer. And so when there are questions of pay rates, paid time off, things like that, it's really important that can be a very specific area of law that people need to reach out to labor lawyers or in there are resources with our government as well. The Wage and Hour Division, the Department of Labor, resources where people can see, am I being treated fairly? Or is this workplace discrimination? Or is this in violation of the terms of my visa, my prevailing wage? Those are very complicated questions, but they're very important to ask.
So, Magen, for that physical therapist, what has happened to them, to their case?
Well, so as, Mindy asked about successes and failures, and this is an example of a case that was a success because she is now employed happily as a physical therapist, and she loves her job and loves her employer. There were some hurdles she had to overcome, and she did have to stand up for herself. She decided to leave employment, and she did have to face some legal repercussions and some legal threats, but ultimately the case settled amicably, and she was able to find herself in a much better situation. So it's not without confrontation, and often that's what the law is. The law allows us to confront issues head on, and sometimes it can be a little daunting, but once you overcome that, there can be a great result. And she's very happy now.
So, Magen, in closing, are there parting words you want to say to our viewers and listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to, let your listeners and viewers know that I am offering myself as a resource. I'm only licensed to practice in the state of Florida. So if there are contractual issues and you're not in Florida, I might not be able to help you. But I will absolutely do what I can to help put you in touch with somebody or help coordinate with agencies or however I can. Like I said, my goal is to help educate and help people and be a resource for them. So, that offer is out there and that offer stands.
Thank you, Magen. I'm sure with all of that information that you've shared, our listeners and viewers will be able to share it to those who need it. And I'm sure there were also listeners who learned a lot from this episode. So we appreciate and thank you for your knowledge and expertise.
Thank you.
And that is all that we have for this episode. I want to thank our guest, Attorney Magen Kellam, my co-host, Mindy Ofiana, our director and producer, Rodney Cajudo, our executive producers, PNAA President, Dr. Mary Joy Garcia-Dia, and PNAA Executive Director, Carmina Bautista. Join us every Wednesday here on Rise Up. Until then, keep on rising. See you next week.